All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Natalie, museum curator. The words are a label on a specimen jar, and I am the thing pinned inside, exposed under the harsh, clinical light of Dr. Evans's office. The air smells like fake lavender and regret. Daniel is next to me on the two-plush sofa, a careful 6 inches between us, his body angled away as if even the proximity of our knees might contaminate him. He's wearing the blue sweater I bought him for his birthday, the one that makes his eyes look like the summer sky over Cape Cod. Those eyes are now fixed on a faint water stain on the ceiling tile, studying it as if it holds the answer to a question no one has asked. 11 years. 11 years of his socks on the floor, of his laugh echoing in our kitchen, of his hand finding mine in the dark. 11 years of building a life I thought was as solid and real as the 19th century portraiture I catalog for a living. But now, in this beige room, it's all dissolving into brushstrokes, a pretty illusion. Natalie, Dr. Evans says gently, her voice a calibrated instrument of patience. You said you felt a shift after the company gala last month. Can you elaborate on that? I clasp my hands together to stop their trembling. I can feel Daniel's stillness, a statue of a man. It was the way he told the story, I begin, my voice sounding thin and far away. The story about the fire alarm going off at the hotel. He's never been a good storyteller, Daniel. He gets the order wrong, forgets punchlines. But this one was perfect. I risk a glance at him. His jaw is tight, a muscle flickers. He had all the details. The exact time the alarm blared, 10,117 p.m. The name of the flustered event coordinator, Brenda, with a red clipboard. The way the sprinklers didn't go off, but the hallway filled with the smell of burned popcorn from the kitchen. He told it with flourish. Like he'd rehearsed it. I swallow, the memory curdling in my stomach, and I remember sitting there at our breakfast table, listening to this flawless, polished anecdote, and this cold, silent thought just dropped into my mind. He didn't come up with that on his own. Someone helped him craft that. Dr. Evans nods, encouraging. Daniel shifts, finally tearing his gaze from the ceiling. It was a funny story, Nat. I just remembered it clearly because it was chaotic. It's not just that, I press on, the momentum of my dread carrying me forward. It's the new cologne, the way he started listening to that podcast about architecture, a subject he's never shown an interest in. It's the way his phone, which used to live on the coffee table, now never leaves his pocket. It's the perfect rehearsed story, Daniel. It's all of it. It's a collage of tiny, insignificant details that together form a different man. The silence in the room is absolute, thick and heavy. Dr. Evans looks from me to Daniel. Daniel, how does it feel to hear Natalie's concerns? He lets out a long, weary sigh, the sigh of a man unbearably put upon. It's a sigh I know well. It's the sigh that precedes him explaining why I'm overreacting. But this time, he doesn't speak. He just runs a hand through his hair, a gesture of exhaustion that feels performative. And then he does something he has never ever done in 11 years. He lies to me without saying a word. He looks directly at Dr. Evans, a look of pained bewilderment, and gives a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It's a minuscule motion, a dismissal, a negation of my reality, of my pain, of my intelligence. It's the cruelest thing he has ever done. In that nanosecond, the foundation of our marriage doesn't just crack, it vaporizes. The cold thought in my mind isn't a whisper anymore, it's a scream. My heart isn't breaking, it's calcifying. The curated, carefully presented life we've built together is a facade, and I am staring at the man behind the curtain, and he is shrugging. The air leaves my lungs in a rush. I don't cry, I don't shout. The pain is too vast, too profound for noise. It is a silent, internal annihilation. I am a museum after hours. Vast and empty and echoing, every exhibit of our love now exposed as a clever forgery. I look at the man I married, the father of my child, and I see a stranger who has been carefully constructing this moment, building a lie so elaborate he almost had me convinced I was the one who was crazy. He must see the knowledge in my eyes because his performative exhaustion falters, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. It's all the confirmation I will ever need. Dr. Evans is saying something about communication and perceived realities, but her voice is muffled, as if I'm submerged in deep water. All I can hear is the deafening roar of the truth. The truth that my husband, Daniel, is having an affair. And in the quiet beige stillness of the therapist's office, my old life ends. The drive home from Dr. Evans's office was a study in suffocating silence. It was a 23-minute journey that felt both instantaneous and eternal. Daniel didn't try the radio. He didn't try to speak. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers against a light, misting rain, and the deafening roar of the lie that now filled the car, pressing against the windows, threatening to shatter the glass. I stared out at the blurred gray world of suburban Massachusetts, the familiar colonial houses and manicured lawns now looking like a film set, a painted backdrop for a life that was no longer mine. My mind wasn't racing, it was methodically, coldly cataloging. I am a curator. It is my job to take disparate artifacts and arrange them into a coherent, truthful narrative. For 11 years, I had curated our marriage, selecting the best moments, preserving them, displaying them. Now, my professional instincts turned inward, towards the wreckage. Exhibit A, the sudden interest in postmodernist architecture, a topic he'd once called pretentious nonsense. Exhibit B, the faint, unfamiliar scent of sandalwood on his collar one Tuesday evening. The new guy at work wears a lot of cologne, he'd said. It must have rubbed off. Exhibit C, the perfect, polished story about the fire alarm. The centerpiece of the collection. Each piece clicked into place with a terrible, final certainty. The exhibit was titled, The Unmaking of a Marriage. He pulled into our driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel in a way that sounded obscenely normal. Our house, a charming Cape Cod we'd painstakingly restored, looked back at me. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene, and every room held evidence I hadn't known I was collecting. He turned off the ignition. The silence became absolute. Natalie, he began, his voice low, placating. The voice you use on a spooked animal? What happened back there? You're taking a look and a sigh and twisting it into something it wasn't. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on our front door, on the cheerful yellow paint I'd chosen because it said, Happy Home. Who is she, Daniel? A beat of silence. Then, a weary exhalation. There is no she, Nat, and many H-mandation to D-tries. This is exactly what I was talking about with Dr. Evans. You get an idea in your head and you just run with it. You're looking for problems. I finally turned to face him. The panic I'd seen flash in his eyes in the office was gone, expertly buried under layers of practiced exasperation. He was good. He'd had practice. The realization was a fresh knife twist. It's not a look. It's not a sigh. It's a pattern. It's a curated pattern of behavior, and I am done being your gullible audience. My voice was eerily calm, a flat line. I asked you a question. Who is she? His mask of frustration slipped just for a second, revealing a flicker of anger beneath. He didn't like being accused. He didn't like his performance being critiqued. This is insane. I'm not having this conversation. You're being paranoid. Paranoid. The word hung in the air, the ultimate dismissal. It was designed to make me doubt my own senses, my own sanity. For a fraction of a second, it worked. What if I was wrong? What if I was the broken one, seeing betrayal in innocent details, destroying my own life with unfounded suspicions? But then, I saw it. On the console between our seats, his phone lit up. A text message preview flashed on the screen. Jenny, hope it wasn't too bad. Thinking of you. JX, the world stopped. Jenny, Jennifer Moss. His college girlfriend, the old flame who had moved back to Boston a year ago. The one he'd told me he'd had a brief, casual coffee with to catch up. I'd even said it was nice he was reconnecting with old friends. The name was a key that unlocked every lie. The architecture podcast? Jenny was an architect. The sandalwood, her signature scent, I suddenly, devastatingly remembered from a party years ago. The perfectly crafted stories? They were for her. They were always for her. I didn't say a word. I just looked from the phone screen to his face. All the color drained from his. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen and the actor was exposed, naked and terrified under the stark stage lights. Nat, he breathed, his voice a strangled thing. He reached for the phone, but it was too late. The evidence had been presented. The authentication was complete. I opened the car door and got out. The misty rain felt like needles on my skin. I walked to the front door, my legs moving on autopilot, my keys feeling alien in my hand. I heard his car door open and shut, heard his hurried footsteps on the gravel behind me. Natalie, wait. Let me explain. It's not what you think. I unlocked the door and stepped inside our home. The warmth, the smell of the lemon polish I used on the hardwood floors, the sight of our son's tiny sneakers kicked off by the door. It was a violent assault on my senses. This was the life he was risking. This was the life he was shattering. I turned to face him as he came through the door, his expression a messy collage of fear, guilt, and a desperate, calculating hope that he could still somehow glue the pieces back together. "It's not what I think," I echoed, my calm finally fracturing, my voice rising into something sharp and broken. "What is it then, Daniel? Is she your client? Is she a colleague? Is it just emotional? Is that the line you're going to use? That it doesn't count?" He flinched, and I knew I'd hit the target. That was exactly the line he prepared. It started as just talking," he stammered, running his hand through his hair again. The gesture now seemed pathetic, not weary. "It was innocent. We reconnected, and she understands things, work stress, everything. I am your wife. I am your wife." The words tore out of me, a raw, guttural scream that echoed in the tidy hallway. "I am the one who is supposed to understand. You're supposed to talk to me. Did you ever think to try that? Or was it just easier to run back to a fantasy from 20 years ago?" He looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. The silence was his confession. The anger that had been frozen inside me by the shock began to melt, flooding my veins, hot and destructive. I walked past him, into the living room, my eyes scanning the shelves, the walls, the curated museum of our life together. My gaze landed on a framed photograph from our wedding day. We were laughing, his forehead pressed against mine, my veil catching the light. It was the portrait of perfect happiness, a masterpiece of deception. I picked it up. The glass was cool under my fingers. "Nat, please," he said, following me into the room, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Put that down. Let's talk. We can fix this." I looked from his pleading, guilty face to the photograph of the two blissful, ignorant fools we used to be. And I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was devastating, that it was unfixable. The artifact was a fake. The entire exhibit was based on a forgery. I didn't throw it. I didn't scream. I simply opened my hands and let it fall. The sound of the shattering glass was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just the picture frame. It was our marriage. It was our past. It was every illusion I had cherished. It lay on the hardwood floor in 1,000 glittering, irreparable pieces. I looked at the wreckage, then at my husband. "We're done," I said, my voice quiet once more, emptied of everything but truth. "Get out." This time, he didn't argue. He just stood there, staring at the shattered glass, a man finally facing the destruction he had wrought. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the house, closing the door softly behind him. I stood alone in the silence, surrounded by the beautiful, fragile pieces of my life, listening to the sound of his car pulling away, and for the first time, I began to cry. The crying didn't last. It was a storm that passed quickly, leaving behind a landscape of eerie, hollow calm. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating. It was vast and empty, a blank canvas. I was alone inside a diorama of my former life. Every object, every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf was an artifact from a civilization that had just collapsed. I looked at the shattered glass on the floor. My first foolish instinct was to clean it up, to restore order, to sweep away the evidence of the explosion so I could pretend it never happened. But I stopped myself. My hand, hovering over the dustpan, froze. No, this was not something to be cleaned up. This was not a mess. This was a monument. This was the first true thing to happen in this house in a long time. I left the glass there. A dangerous, glittering memorial in the middle of the living room. I stepped around it carefully, a curator preserving a site of historical significance. The next hour was a methodical autopsy. I moved through the house not as a wife, but as a forensic archaeologist. My tools were not brushes and trowels, but a cold, detached curiosity. I started with his office, a small room off the kitchen he called his study, though he mostly used it to store golf clubs and old tax returns. The desk was tidy. Too tidy. Daniel was inherently messy. His sock drawer looked like a nest for agitated squirrels. This order was performed. I pulled open the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, a stapler. Normal. The second drawer held files. Mortgage statements, insurance policies. Boring. It was the bottom drawer, the deep one, that held the first secret. It was locked. I almost laughed. A locked drawer. How cliché. How utterly, devastatingly predictable. I ransacked the other drawers looking for a key, my movements becoming less detached, more frantic. Nothing. I sat back on my heels, my heart hammering against my ribs. The locked drawer stared at me, a smug, wooden face. I went to the kitchen and returned with a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the cupboard, a wedding gift from my aunt. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the damage. I raised the skillet and brought it down on the cheap wooden lock with a force that jarred my entire arm. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack. The sound was violent, decisive. It felt good. It felt like action. I yanked the drawer open. Inside wasn't a treasure trove of love letters or scandalous photos. It was something worse. It was an archive of a parallel life. Receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, tucked inside a book on architectural theory. A program from a symphony performance I thought he'd attended with a client. A single silver cufflink that wasn't his style. And a map of Boston, with certain L-stops circled in red pen her neighborhood, I realized with a sickening lurch. Each item was mundane on its own, but together they formed a chilling narrative. This wasn't a passionate, impulsive affair. This was a planned, curated second existence. He had been meticulously building a life with her, souvenir by souvenir, while eating dinner with me and our son. I sank to the floor, the receipts spilling into my lap. The date on a coffee shop receipt was from our anniversary. He'd told me he was stuck in traffic. He'd brought me flowers that night, his hands smelling of bitter coffee and betrayal. The doorbell rang. The sound was so alien, so violently out of place in my private world of collapse that I screamed. A short, sharp sound of pure terror. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking, the receipts clutched like a bouquet of lies. It rang again. Insistent. I crept to the front window and peered through the blinds. A police cruiser was idling in my driveway. My blood ran cold. Had Daniel done something? Had he? The thoughts were a panicked jumble. I opened the door a crack. A young police officer stood there, his expression neutral, professional. "Ma'am, we received a call from a neighbor. A report of a possible domestic disturbance?" He heard what sounded like a scream and the sound of something breaking. Of course. Mr. Gable, the retired widower next door, with ears like a satellite dish and nothing but time on his hands. For a moment, I considered it. I could invite him in. I could show him the shattered glass, the splintered drawer, the evidence of the real disturbance that had happened here. I could have Daniel arrested for what? Or breaking my heart? I looked past the officer to my perfectly manicured street. The world was still turning. People were mowing their lawns, bringing in groceries. Life was going on as if my personal universe hadn't just been vaporized. "Ma'am?" the officer prompted, a hint of concern in his voice. "Is everything all right? Is anyone else in the house?" I looked at him, this stranger tasked with keeping the peace. How could I possibly explain the war zone inside these walls? The peace was already lost. It had been gone for months, and I was the last to know. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "No one else is here. I'm sorry for the disturbance." I dropped something. A large mirror. It startled me, and I yelled. "It was stupid. I'm so sorry to have wasted your time." I offered him a smile. It felt like a crack in a plaster cast, fragile and painful. He looked skeptical, his eyes trying to see past me into the house. "You're sure you're okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," I insisted, the lie smooth and automatic. "Just a clumsy afternoon. Thank you for checking." "Really, I appreciate it." He hesitated for another moment, then finally nodded. All right, ma'am, you have a good day. Be careful with the glass. I will. I closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down to the floor until I was sitting with my knees pulled to my chest. The interaction had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had drained me completely. The performative normalcy was exhausting. I looked across the hallway at the broken glass, the splintered wood of the desk drawer, the papers scattered on the floor. The officer's words echoed in my head. Domestic disturbance. This wasn't a disturbance. A disturbance implied things could be settled, quieted, returned to order. This was an extinction-level event. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I flinched. Daniel, it had to be, probably texting to see if I'd calm down, if I was ready to be rational. I pulled it out, my thumb hovering over the button to block his number forever. But it wasn't Daniel. The screen glowed with a notification from my son's summer camp app. Reminder, pickup for parent weekend is this Friday at 3 p.m. Can't wait to see you. DA, the world, which had narrowed to the size of my living room and the contents of a splintered drawer, suddenly snapped back into terrifying, wide-angle focus. Leo, my sweet, funny 8-year-old boy, who was at camp, blissfully unaware that the foundation of his world had just been dynamited. Who thought he was coming home to his mom and dad, to pizza night and stories about canoeing. A sound escaped my throat, a half-sob, half-gasp. I had been so consumed by my own pain, I had completely forgotten about his. The sheer selfish horror of it crashed over me. What was I going to do? What was I going to say to him? Mommy and Daddy had a fight? Daddy made some bad choices? Our family is broken? The detached archaeological calm was gone. This was no longer about excavating the past. This was about the future, my son's future, and the terrifying, yawning chasm of what came next. The unraveling wasn't over. It had only just begun, and I was standing on the edge, holding the loose thread, with no idea how to stop it. The next 48 hours were a fugue state. I moved through the house like a ghost, haunting the ruins of my own life. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I pick up a cup of coffee, bring it to my lips, and forget to drink. The world had lost all taste, all color. The only thing that felt real was the cold, hard knot of pain in my chest. Daniel's texts came in waves. Apologies, excuses, please, then, finally, anger. Natalie, please. We need to talk about Leo. You can't just shut me out. He's my son too. What are you going to tell him? I have a right to be there. Each vibration of the phone was a fresh assault. I finally turned it off and threw it into the laundry basket, burying it under a pile of dirty towels. Out of sight, but not out of mind. His words echoed in the silence. What are you going to tell him? It was the only question that mattered, and I had no answer. The truth was a hand grenade, and Leo was too young, too innocent to be holding the pin. A lie felt like a betrayal of a different kind, a continuation of the false narrative Daniel had built. I was trapped between an atrocity and a fabrication. I found myself standing in the doorway of Leo's room. It was a perfect snapshot of an 8-year-old boy's life. A half-built Lego spaceship on the desk, a poster of the solar system on the wall, his favorite stuffed dog, Buster, perched on the pillow. The air smelled of crayons and boyhood. This room was a sanctuary of pure, uncorrupted love. And I was about to be the one who introduced the virus into this perfect ecosystem. The weight of it crushed me. I slid down the doorframe onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and finally, I let the silent, screaming void inside me have its way. I cried until my throat was raw. I cried for Leo, for the uncomplicated trust he had in his world that was about to be shattered. I cried for myself, for the woman who believed in her marriage, for the future we had planned that was now ash. I even cried for Daniel, for the pathetic, weak man who had thrown all of this away for a cheap fantasy and who would now have to live with the consequences. The tears were a storm that left me hollowed out and empty. But in that emptiness, a single, clear thought emerged. It was not a plan. It was not a solution. It was an impulse, a primal scream translated into action. I couldn't be here. I couldn't be in this house, surrounded by the ghosts of my failed marriage, waiting for the clock to strike 3 on Friday when I would have to look my son in the eye and destroy his world. I couldn't sit here and wait for Daniel to come back, to try and talk, to try and explain the inexplicable. I had to go, somewhere. Anywhere. My eyes landed on Leo's globe, sitting on his bookshelf. I crawled over to it, my limbs heavy, and spun it. The world blurred into a swirl of color. I closed my eyes and stopped it with my finger. I opened my eyes. The tip of my finger was resting on a vast, cold-looking island in the North Atlantic. Iceland. It felt right. A place of fire and ice. A place of stark, brutal, beautiful landscapes that mirrored the desolation inside me. A place where no one knew me. A place where I could scream into the wind and no one would hear me. The decision, insane and impulsive, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my numb body. It was the first thing I had decided for myself in months that wasn't a reaction to Daniel. It was pure, undiluted self-preservation. I went to my laptop, my hands shaking not with grief now, but with a frantic, desperate energy. I booked a flight, the last seat on a plane leaving Logan Airport for Reykjavik in 5 hours. I didn't look at the cost. I didn't care. I used the joint savings account, our money, and it felt like an act of vengeance. Then I packed. I threw things into a suitcase with no thought or care. Warm clothes, a camera, my old, neglected Nikon. I hadn't taken a photograph for pleasure in years. I shoved it in. I didn't know why. I wrote 2 emails. The first was to my assistant at the museum, a lie about a family emergency requiring my immediate, brief absence. The second was to Daniel. It was short and left no room for discussion. I am leaving for a few days. I will be unreachable. We will discuss Leo when I return. Do not try to stop me. I didn't sign it. What was there to sign? I was no longer the Nat he thought he knew. I called a taxi. I didn't want to leave my car at the airport, a beacon for him to find. As I waited on the front steps, the suitcase beside me, I looked back at the house. It looked like a beautiful empty shell. A museum after hours. All the exhibits dormant, all the stories over. The taxi driver, a man with a kind face, loaded my bag into the trunk. Going on vacation? He asked cheerfully. I looked at him, and for a moment, I considered telling him the truth. That I was a refugee. That I was fleeing the scene of a crime. That I was going to the edge of the world to see if I could still feel anything. Something like that, I said, and got in the car. The journey was a blur. The airport, the gate, the slow, shuffling line of passengers. I felt like I was moving underwater. I boarded the plane, found my window seat, and stared out at the tarmac. As the plane taxied and then roared into the sky, climbing through the clouds, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't relief. It wasn't freedom. It was the feeling of jumping off a cliff. I was leaving behind everything I knew. My home, my husband, my child, my job, and hurling myself into the unknown. The vast, terrifying abyss of my future was below me, and I was in free fall. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched as the lights of Boston, of my entire life, dwindled into a tiny, insignificant cluster of sparks, and then were swallowed completely by the dark. The woman who had walked into that therapist's office was gone. The woman who had shattered the picture frame was gone. Who was left, alone in the dark at 30 feet, hurtling toward a land of ice, was a question mark. A raw, open nerve. A void. And for the first time since it all began, the silence inside me felt like my own. Iceland was not a country, it was a state of being. A raw, elemental expanse of wind-scoured rock, moss that glowed an unearthly green under a low gray sky, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. The rental car, a tiny, shivering tin can on the endless ring road, was the only thing separating me from the primal fury of the landscape. I had been driving for 2 days. Or maybe 3. Time had lost all meaning in the perpetual twilight of the Arctic summer. I'd sleep in cramped guest houses that smelled of damp wool and old wood, force down meals of bread and smoked fish I couldn't taste, and then drive again. I was chasing something, though I didn't know what. Absolution, maybe? Or simply a place so empty it could hold all my pain without overflowing. I found it at Jerkul Sarlon, the glacial lagoon. I stood on the black sand beach, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy, tearing at my clothes. Before me, the lagoon was a surreal, dreamlike spectacle. Icebergs, calved from the great glacier Vatnajökull, floated in milky azure water. They were sculptures carved by nature itself, jagged, majestic, impossibly blue, gleaming like jewels against the grim sky. They drifted slowly, silently, toward the open sea, where the waves of the Atlantic grabbed them and tossed their remains onto the black sand shore, where they lay like shattered glass, melting back into nothingness. I watched a particularly large berg, a miniature mountain of ice, bob in the water. It was beautiful and tragic. Its entire existence was a slow, inevitable journey toward its own destruction. It was born from the glacier only to die in the sea, a lifetime of slow movement, of erosion, of being shaped by forces beyond its control, all leading to this final, quiet dissolution on a nameless beach. A sob caught in my throat. I saw myself in that iceberg. I was that iceberg. My marriage, my life, everything I had built, it had all cabbed off the glacier of my old self and was now adrift, being worn down, heading for its own inevitable end on a lonely shore. The profound, crushing loneliness of the metaphor enveloped me. I was alone at the edge of the world, watching my own heartbreak reflected in a dying piece of ice. The tears came then, hot and furious, ripped away by the wind the moment they left my eyes. I cried for the loss, for the betrayal, for the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. I cried until I was empty, until there was nothing left inside me but the howl of the wind and the hollow ache in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, but as the storm of grief passed, a strange clarity descended. The emptiness wasn't a void anymore, it was a blank page. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was peaceful. Almost without thinking, I reached into my backpack and pulled out my old Nikon. I hadn't used it in years. Daniel had always found my photography hobby quaint, something to be indulged between more important things, like his work dinners and our social obligations. Slowly, I raised the camera to my eye, my cold fingers fumbling with the dials. The world shrank to a rectangle of light and shadow. I focused on the icebergs. Through the lens, their tragedy transformed. The cracks weren't flaws, they were history. The blue wasn't the color of cold, it was the color of ancient, compressed time. The way they caught the weak, diffused light wasn't pathetic, it was defiant. Click. The sound was small and decisive against the wind. Click, click. I wasn't just taking pictures. I was bearing witness. I was documenting not death, but transformation. The ice wasn't dying, it was changing state. From solid to liquid. From one form to another. It was a cycle, not an end. I moved along the beach, my boots crunching on the black sand, my eye glued to the viewfinder. I photographed the diamonds of the icebergs. I photographed the way the water swirled around them. I photographed a single, perfect piece of ice, clear as glass, resting on the black sand like a forgotten jewel. In that moment, behind the camera, I disappeared. Natalie, the betrayed wife. Natalie, the heartbroken woman. Natalie, the fearful mother. She vanished. There was only the eye, the light, and the subject. The all-consuming self-pity was gone, replaced by a rapt, focused attention on something outside of myself. It was the first time in weeks I had stopped thinking about Daniel, about the affair, about the ruin of my life. I was just seeing. As I framed a shot of a wave washing over a chunk of ice, a thought occurred to me, so simple and yet so revolutionary it almost made me drop the camera. This is beautiful. The pain was still there. The loss was still absolute. But alongside it, coexisting in the same heart, was a sense of awe. The world was still beautiful. It was broken and cruel and breathtakingly beautiful, and I could still see it. I could still feel it. The ice was melting, but the water would rise into the clouds and fall as rain, feeding the moss, flowing back to the glacier. Nothing was ever truly lost. It was only changed. I lowered the camera and looked out at the lagoon, my face wet with tears that were no longer just of sorrow, but of a dawning, fragile understanding. I had come to Iceland to escape, to numb myself, to find a place big enough to hold my grief. But I had found something else instead. A tiny frozen seed of hope. Not hope that Daniel and I would reconcile. That iceberg had sailed. But hope for me, for Natalie. The woman behind the camera. The woman behind the camera. The journey toward my own destruction, I realized, was also a journey toward my own reshaping. I was being broken down, yes. But maybe, just maybe, I could be remade into something stronger, something more resilient, something that, like the ice on the black sand, could still catch the light in a stunning, defiant way, even in the process of its own transformation. I turned my back on the lagoon and walked to the car. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time since I'd walked into Dr. Evans's office, the future didn't feel like an abyss. It felt like an undeveloped photograph, waiting in the dark for the image to appear. The flight back to Boston was a journey through a different kind of turbulence. Not the physical kind that rattled the drink carts, but the emotional kind that rattled my soul. The woman staring out the window wasn't the same one who had fled. The numbness had receded, replaced by a raw hyper-awareness. The pain was still there, a constant, low hum, but it was no longer the only thing playing on the radio of my mind. Now, there was a new frequency, a grim, determined static. I had taken over 300 photographs in Iceland. On the flight, I scrolled through them on my laptop. The jagged cliffs, the endless black beaches, the impossible green moss, the glaciers, and the ice. So much ice. Each photo was a frozen piece of my grief, but also a piece of my clarity. I saw the story they told, not just of a landscape, but of a state of mind. From the initial chaotic shattering to the slow, inevitable, beautiful melt. I landed not with a sense of peace, but with a sense of purpose. The abyss was still there, but I was no longer free-falling. I had grabbed a rope. That rope was my camera. It was my son. It was the sheer, stubborn will to not let Daniel's betrayal be the thing that defined the rest of my life. The house greeted me with a musty silence. It still smelled of lemon polish and regret. The shattered glass was still on the living room floor. I had left it as a monument, and a monument it had remained. I didn't clean it up immediately. First, I went to Leo's room and inhaled the scent of him. I needed that anchor. Then, I got to work. I started in the bedroom. I opened the closet. Daniel's side was still full. His suits, his shirts, his rows of perfectly polished shoes. They looked like artifacts in a museum exhibit. The husband, a retrospective. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold, surgical need to excise a tumor. I found a stack of empty moving boxes in the garage. I brought them upstairs and began to pack his things. I was my professional self, the curator, deaccessioning a collection that had been deemed fraudulent. I folded his shirts with methodical precision. I packed his shoes. I took his suits off the hangers and laid them in a box. I didn't throw anything. I didn't burn it. That was a different kind of energy, a hot energy, and mine was cold and sharp as Icelandic ice. Each item was a memory, but I refused to let them trigger me. The blue sweater was just wool. The tie I bought him for our 5th anniversary was just silk. I was dismantling the evidence of our life together, piece by piece, and with each box I sealed, I felt a little lighter, a little more space opening up in the world I was about to rebuild. My phone, charged and turned back on, buzzed incessantly. Daniel. His texts had shifted from pleading to demanding. Where are you? We need to talk about Leo. My lawyer says, you can't keep me from my son, Natalie. I didn't respond. I took a photo of the sealed boxes, stacked neatly in the hallway. I attached it to a text and wrote only 2 words, come get them. The response was immediate. My God, Natalie. Are you in the house? I'm coming over. We need to talk. No, I typed back, my fingers steady. You can come get your things on Saturday at 10 a.m. I will not be here. If you are 1 minute early or 1 minute late, I will donate everything to Goodwill. The typing bubbles appeared, danced, and disappeared. He knew I meant it. The new Natalie didn't make threats she wasn't prepared to carry out. Fine, he finally replied. But we are talking about Leo. Soon. I put the phone down. My heart was hammering, but it was with power, not panic. I had set a boundary, and I had held it. The next task was the hardest. I finally approached the shattered glass in the living room. I got the dustpan and brush. I knelt, and with painstaking care, I swept up every last shard. I didn't see our wedding photo anymore. I just saw broken glass, a hazard. I dumped it all into a trash bag, the pieces clinking together like wind chimes made of bad memories. Then, I got a wet cloth and wiped the floor until it was clean. The space where the picture had been was now just an empty patch on the wall, a lighter shade of paint. It wasn't a wound, it was a blank space, a place for a new picture. The doorbell rang, my blood went cold. It wasn't Saturday, it was only Thursday. Had he come anyway? I crept to the window, my newfound courage faltering. But it wasn't Daniel. A woman from a flower delivery service stood on my porch, holding a massive, extravagant bouquet of white lilies. Daniel's signature "I'm sorry" flower. They were my favorite. Or, they used to be. Now, the sight of them made me nauseous. They weren't an apology, they were a performance. A prop. I opened the door. The young woman smiled. "Delivery for Natalie Foster?" "Thank you," I said, taking the heavy vase. She left with a cheerful wave. I stood in my hallway, holding the beautiful, funereal flowers. They smelled of perfume and false promises. I carried them through the house, out the back door, and into the yard. Without ceremony, I upended the vase into the trash bin. The water splashed, the lilies tumbled in a heap of wasted elegance. I didn't keep the vase. I went back inside, picked up my camera, and walked into the living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the empty space on the wall. I raised the camera, framed the shot, the clean floor, the empty space, the sunlight falling on the spot where the past had been shattered and swept away. Click. It was the first photograph of my new life. It wasn't of ice or mountains. It was of absence. And it was the most powerful picture I had ever taken. I was ready for Leo to come home. The world did not end when I picked up Leo from camp. The sun did not fall from the sky. Instead, it was a perfectly ordinary Friday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of pine needles and bug spray, filled with the shrieks and laughter of children being returned to their parents. Leo exploded from the cluster of kids, a whirlwind of tanned skin, messy hair, and boundless 8-year-old energy. He launched himself at me, wrapping his arms around my waist with a force that nearly knocked me over. "Mom, you'll never believe it. We caught a frog this big. And I learned how to do a kayak roll. Well, almost. I swallowed a lot of lake water. His voice, so familiar and bright, was an anchor in the stormy sea of my anxiety. I held him tightly, breathing in his unique scent of sunshine, dirt, and little boy. For a moment, I could almost pretend everything was normal. "That sounds amazing, sweetie," I said, my voice only catching a little. "I missed you so much. Missed you too. Where's Dad? Did he come? Is he parking the car?" He pulled back, his bright eyes scanning the parking lot behind me. The question I had been dreading. I had rehearsed 100 answers in my head on the drive-up. Gentle lies, soft metaphors. But looking down at his open, trusting face, I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't lie. But I also couldn't tell him the whole devastating truth. The truth was a meal too big for him to digest all at once. I knelt down so we were eye level, my hands on his shoulders. "Dad's not here, buddy. He and I, we're having some grown-up problems right now. He's staying somewhere else for a little while." Leo's face crumpled. The radiant joy vanished, replaced by confusion and a flicker of fear. "Problems? What kind of problems? Did he have to go on a work trip?" "No, honey. Not a work trip." I chose my words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. We need some space from each other right now. It's nobody's fault. Especially not yours. We both love you more than anything in the whole world. That will never, ever change. It was the barest minimum of the truth, but it was still truth. He searched my face, his little brain trying to process this seismic shift in his universe. I saw the moment the worry overshadowed the confusion. "Are you and Dad getting a divorce?" he whispered, the words sounding too big and ugly coming from his mouth. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Right now, we're just taking some time apart. The most important thing for you to know is that you are safe, and you are loved, and our family is still your family, even if it looks a little different for a while." Tears welled in his eyes. He didn't cry, but he let me pull him into another fierce hug. "I don't want it to look different," he mumbled into my shoulder. "I know, baby, I know." The drive home was quieter than the drive to camp. Leo stared out the window, uncharacteristically silent. The weight of his sadness was a physical presence in the car, a heavy blanket smothering the joy of his return. My heart ached for him. This was the collateral damage. This was the real cost of Daniel's choices. When we got home, he ran to his room and closed the door. I gave him space, my own heartbreaking. I busied myself unpacking his duffel bag, the smell of campfire and damp towels filling the hallway. After a while, his door creaked open. "Mom," he said, his voice small, "can we still have pizza night?" The question was a lifeline. It was his way of asking if any part of his world was still intact. "Absolutely," I said, my voice brimming with a forced cheerfulness I didn't feel. "Extra pepperoni, and we can build a fort in the living room." A tiny, tentative smile touched his lips. Okay. That night, as we sat in a blanket fort constructed from every sheet and blanket in the house, eating pizza and watching a silly cartoon, a new routine was born. It was born from the ashes of the old one. It was fragile and sad around the edges, but it was ours. It was real. The next morning, after Leo was settled with his Legos, I did something for myself. I picked up my camera. I hadn't touched it since Iceland. It felt different in my hands now, heavier with purpose. I didn't go far. I walked into my own backyard. The late summer light was slanting through the oak trees, dappling the grass. I saw a spiderweb strung between two branches, beaded with morning dew, each droplet holding a miniature, perfect world. I knelt in the damp grass and raised the camera. Click. I spent an hour in the backyard. I photographed the intricate veins of a fallen leaf, the slow, determined journey of a ladybug. The way the light hit the rim of my forgotten coffee mug. It wasn't the dramatic landscape of Iceland. It was small, it was quiet, it was mine. When I came back inside, Leo looked up from his spaceship. "What were you doing?" "Taking pictures," I said. "Of what?" "Just things that look interesting." He considered this for a moment. "Can I see?" I sat down next to him and showed him the images on the camera's display. He scrolled through them, his small face serious. "The spider web is cool," he pronounced. "It looks like jewelry." His simple, perfect observation made my breath catch. Through his eyes, I saw the image anew. He was right. The following weekend, I signed up for a class. Introduction to Digital Photography, offered at the local community center on Saturday mornings. It was a small thing, a few hours a week, but it was a commitment to myself, to seeing the world again, to building a new routine that didn't revolve around the ghost of my marriage. The first class was full of retirees and bored teenagers. I was the only one there whose life had recently exploded. But as the instructor talked about aperture and shutter speed, about telling stories with light and shadow, I felt a part of my brain, long dormant, flicker back to life. It was the part that was just for me. Natalie. Not a wife, not a mother. A student. A photographer. I picked up Leo from my parents' house afterwards. "How was your class?" he asked, buckling his seatbelt. "It was good," I said. "I learned how to make a picture blurry in the background." "Cool," he said. Then, after a pause, "Dad called while you were gone. He wants to take me to the movies tomorrow." The knot in my stomach tightened, but I kept my voice neutral. "That sounds like fun." "Do you want to go?" He nodded, but he looked unsure. "Will you be okay by yourself?" The question was a dagger and a balm all at once. So perceptive, so caring. "My little man, I will be perfectly okay," I said, and for the first time, I almost believed it. "I'll probably go take more pictures." And that's how the new routine solidified. Saturdays were for my class. Sundays, Leo saw his father. The days in between were for us. For homework, for failed baking attempts, for building Lego empires on the living room floor. The rhythm was awkward at first, a song we didn't know the steps to. But we learned it. Step by painful step. The photography was no longer just an escape. It was my ritual, my meditation, my way of processing the world without words. I documented the small, quiet moments of our new life. Leo's concentration as he read a book, the way the afternoon light slanted across his empty chair, the mess of art supplies on the kitchen table. I was curating a new exhibit. The working title was A Life After, and for the first time, I was beginning to believe it could be a permanent collection. The rhythm of our new life became a kind of music. It wasn't the sweeping symphony of a perfect marriage I'd once imagined we had. It was something smaller, more intimate, more real. A duet for cello and piano, perhaps, with moments of dissonance that always resolved into a fragile, beautiful harmony. My Saturday morning photography class became my sanctuary. The classroom, with its faint smell of chemicals and old carpet, was a world away from my life as Natalie, the betrayed wife, the single mother. Here, I was just Natalie, the student. The woman who overthought her aperture settings and got a thrill when a shot turned out exactly as she'd envisioned. Leo's Sundays with Daniel became a rhythm too. The first few times, he'd return quiet and withdrawn, a suitcase of unspoken emotions packed neatly inside his small chest. He'd tell me about the movie, about the pizza, but he'd carefully edit out any mention of her. I knew she was there, hovering at the edges of their outings. Daniel had told me, in one of his rare civil texts, that he'd introduced Leo to Jenny. "He has to get to know her eventually, Nat. It's the new reality." The words had felt like ground glass in my shoe, but I'd said nothing. He was right. It was the new, terrible reality. One Sunday evening, Leo came home later than usual. I was in the dark room I'd rigged up in a spare bathroom, a developing tank in the sink, my photos hung from a string with clothespins. I was examining a print I'd taken that morning at the community garden, a close-up of a sunflower heavy with rain, its face turned downward. I heard the front door open and his small footsteps in the hall. "Mom? In here, buddy." He appeared in the doorway, his face pale. He'd been crying. My heart seized. "What's wrong? What happened?" He shook his head, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing." The movie was loud. It was a transparent lie. I waited, my hands still damp from the fixer. He scuffed his shoe against the doorframe. Jenny was there. "I see," I said, keeping my voice neutral, though my insides were twisting. She calls me Sweet Pea," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "She talks to me like I'm a baby. And she holds Dad's hand all the time." He finally looked at me, his eyes brimming with a confusion that was too old for his face. Why does he let her? Doesn't he know I hate it? The pain in his voice was a physical thing. I wanted to rage. I wanted to call Daniel and scream every foul word I knew. But I didn't. That was the old rhythm. This was the new one. This was about him, not about me. I knelt down. "Oh, Leo. I'm so sorry. That must feel really weird and uncomfortable. Validation first. Always. Your dad, he cares about Jenny. And when people care about each other, they like to hold hands. But that doesn't change how he feels about you. Not one bit. It feels different," he whispered. "I know it does." I pulled him into a hug. "And you don't have to like her. You just have to be polite, okay? That's the rule, for everyone." He nodded against my shoulder. After a moment, he pulled back and looked at the photos hanging behind me. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the sunflower. "It's a picture I took. The rain was really heavy this morning, and it was weighing the flower down." He studied it, his crisis momentarily forgotten in the face of a new curiosity. "It looks sad, maybe a little," I agreed. "But see how the light is catching the water droplets? Even when it's bent over, it's still beautiful. And tomorrow, when the sun comes out, it'll stand right back up again." He was quiet for a long time, looking at the photo. "Can I take a picture?" he asked suddenly. The question surprised me. "Of course you can. What do you want to take a picture of?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Stuff." So I taught him. I showed him how to hold my old camera, how to look through the viewfinder, how to press the button halfway to focus. He was a natural, his small face screwed up in concentration. He didn't take pictures of sunsets or landscapes. He took pictures of his Lego creation from a worm's eye view. He took a picture of Buster the dog perched on a pile of laundry. He took a close-up of the crinkled skin of a clementine. Through his lens, the world became new again. Not a place of pain and complication, but a collection of fascinating shapes, textures, and light. He'd run to me, camera in hand. "Mom, look what I saw." Our duet found a new instrument. Photography became our shared language. We'd go on photo walks, not to any grand location, but just around our neighborhood. We'd point out interesting things to each other. A rusty hinge on a gate. The pattern of shadows from a fence. A bright red leaf stuck in a storm drain. We were curators of the ordinary, archaeologists of the everyday. One Saturday, my photography class had a field trip to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. As a curator, I knew the collection intimately, but I'd never experienced it through a viewfinder. We were tasked with capturing the interplay of art and architecture, of light and shadow in the magnificent courtyard. I lost myself in it. I framed shots of statues against intricate tilework, of sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling, dappling the ferns and flowers below. I was so absorbed I didn't notice the man until I almost backed into him. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said, lowering my camera. "No trouble at all," he said with a warm smile. He was tall, with kind eyes and a camera of his own slung around his neck. "Trying to capture the light on that sarcophagus?" He gestured toward a Roman relic. "Trying," I said, feeling unexpectedly self-conscious. "It's fighting me. The trick is to wait for the cloud to pass," he said, nodding toward the glass roof. "The diffuse light will soften the shadows and bring out the texture in the stone." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, two strangers united by a common purpose. It was the first non-transactional conversation I'd had with a man since Daniel. It wasn't flirtatious. It was just nice. The cloud passed. The light changed. I raised my camera and took the shot. "It was perfect. See?" the man said, smiling. "Worth the wait." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. "Enjoy the rest of the museum," he said with a slight nod, and then he moved on, melting into the crowd of tourists. I stood there for a long time, not looking at the art, but feeling the strange, faint echo of the interaction. It was a tiny, insignificant moment. But it was a note of music I hadn't heard in a long time. The note of a casual, friendly connection with the outside world. A world that existed beyond the borders of my pain. I finished the field trip with a lightness in my step. When I picked up Leo, I told him all about the museum, about the light, about the difficult sarcophagus. I didn't mention the man with the kind eyes. That moment was mine alone, a small, secret talisman I tucked away. That night, as I reviewed my photos, I realized the rhythm of my life was changing again. It was becoming richer, more complex. It wasn't just a duet anymore, it was an orchestra tuning up, the air humming with the promise of music yet to be played. I was no longer just surviving the silence between the notes. I was starting to listen for them. The dark room was my alchemist's lab. In the ruby-red glow, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the scent of chemical solutions, sharp, astringent, and clean, the gentle slosh of liquid in trays, and the slow, magical reveal of an image on a blank sheet of paper. It had started as a whim, an extension of the Saturday class. My instructor, a gruff man with ink-stained fingers named Frank, had mentioned an introductory workshop at a local artists' collective. "You've got an eye for composition, Natalie," he'd said, almost accusingly. "Stop relying on the camera to do all the work. Get your hands dirty." So I did. And I was hooked. The process was a form of meditation. Loading the film onto the spool in complete darkness, my sense of touch heightened, fumbling until it became fluid. The meticulous timing, agitating the developer tank, watching the clock with a focus I hadn't mustered for anything in months. But the real magic was in the enlarger. I'd chosen my best negative from the Gardner Museum trip, the one of the Roman sarcophagus, the light finally soft and perfect on the worn stone. I slipped it into the carrier, focused the image on the easel. In the white light, it looked flat, lifeless. Then, I set the timer, hit the button, and watched the enlarger's light burn the image onto the photographic paper. I slid the paper into the developer tray and began to agitate it with the tongs. For a long moment, nothing. Then, like a ghost emerging from the ether, the image began to appear. The faint lines of the stone, the deep shadows of the carved figures, the subtle gradient of light. It was mine. I had conjured it. Not a computer chip, not a screen. My hands, my timing, my vision. I moved it to the stop bath, then the fixer. The image was permanent now. My creation, my truth. I held it up, dripping, in the red light. It was technically proficient, but it was more than that. It had feeling, a melancholy grandeur. It told a story of endurance, of time wearing away at something beautiful but strong. A week later, Frank stopped by my enlarger station. He grunted as he looked at the print, now dried and pressed. The gardener shot. Good tonal range. He peered closer. You dodged the upper left corner to bring out the detail in the inscription. It wasn't a question. I nodded, surprised he'd noticed. Dodging and burning? Using tools to hold back or add light during the exposure were techniques I'd been practicing with intense concentration. Why? He asked, his beady eyes fixed on me. The inscription was the story, I found myself saying. The sarcophagus is just a box without it. The light was washing it out. It needed to be heard. He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. Good, he walked away, then paused. There's a small juried show next month. New England Perspectives. You should submit this. My heart leapt into my throat. What? No, I'm not. I'm just learning. You're not learning, he called over his shoulder without turning around. You're doing. Submit it. The idea was terrifying. Putting my work, a piece of my soul that I'd physically conjured into being, out for strangers to judge. It felt more vulnerable than anything I'd done yet. But the seed was planted. I started spending more time at the collective. I bought my own paper, my own chemicals. I became a regular in the red-lit basement, often the last one to leave. The other photographers were a motley crew: art students, hobbyists, a few serious artists. We spoke little, bonded by the shared, silent ritual of creation. One evening, I was working on a new series. I was printing the photos I'd taken of Leo, but not the smiling birthday party shots. I was printing the quiet, in-between moments. The concentration on his face as he built a Lego spaceship. The way his hair fell across his forehead as he slept. The thoughtful frown as he looked out the car window. I was using a high-contrast filter, making the blacks deeper, the whites brighter, highlighting the emotional gravity in his small face. A woman named Clara, a retired schoolteacher who printed stunning landscapes, leaned over my shoulder. "Oh, Natalie," she breathed, her voice soft in the humming quiet of the dark room. They're breathtaking. He's a beautiful subject. He's my son, I said, my voice thick with a pride that was entirely separate from the technical skill of the print. You can feel it, she said. The love. It's in every line. It's in the light you chose for him. Her words settled deep inside me. That was it. That was what I was doing. I wasn't just taking pictures. I wasn't just printing them. I was crafting a new narrative. A narrative of love that existed outside of the story Daniel had broken. A narrative of resilience. My love for Leo wasn't a sad, leftover thing from a failed marriage. It was its own powerful, vibrant force. And I was learning how to let the light in to show it. I submitted the print of the sarcophagus to the show. The day I dropped it off, my hands were shaking. It felt like I was leaving a piece of my heart in a sterile, white gallery office. Weeks passed. I put the submission out of my mind, throwing myself into my work at the museum and my new craft at the collective. I was researching a new exhibit on early American portraiture, and the parallels were unnerving. These people, long dead, stared out from their canvases, their lives reduced to a single, curated image. What story had they wanted to tell? What had been left out of the frame? I found myself standing in front of a painting of a Puritan woman, her face stern, her gaze direct. The placard said her name was Prudence, and she had outlived 2 husbands. There was no sadness in her eyes. There was resolve, a fierce, hard-won independence. I felt a sudden, powerful kinship with this woman from the 17th century. We were both survivors. We had both curated our survival. My phone buzzed in my pocket. An email from the New England Perspectives Selection Committee. My breath hitched. I leaned against the wall, next to Prudence's steadfast gaze, and opened it. Dear Miss Foster, it began. We are pleased to inform you that your photograph, Eternal Inscription, has been accepted into the exhibition. I didn't read the rest. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the polished museum floor, right there in the middle of the gallery. I put my head in my hands and cried. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. It wasn't about the show. It wasn't about winning. It was about the fact that I, Natalie Foster, had taken a moment of pain and confusion, and through patience and craft and my own 2 hands, had transformed it into something beautiful. Something permanent. Something that was wholly and completely mine. I had curated my own redemption, and for the first time, I understood that the most important exhibit I would ever build was the one of my own life. And I was finally holding the brush. The opening night of the New England Perspectives show was a quiet affair, held in a small, brick-walled gallery in Cambridge. I almost didn't go. The vulnerability of having my work, a piece of my internal world pinned to a wall for public consumption, felt like walking into a room naked. But Clara from the darkroom had insisted. "You have to be there to hear the silence," she'd said cryptically. "It's the best sound in the world." I went alone. I wore a simple black dress, a uniform of sorts. My armor. Leo was with Daniel for the weekend, a fact that still sent a familiar pang through me, though it was now a duller ache. My photograph, eternal inscription, was hung in a corner, bathed in a small, perfect spot of light. Seeing it there, framed and official, with my name on a little placard beside it, sent a jolt through my system. It was real. I had done this. Not as Daniel's wife. Not as Leo's mom. As Natalie. The artist. I stood back, pretending to examine a nearby sculpture, and watched people as they passed my piece. Some glanced and moved on. Others paused. One woman tilted her head, studying it for a long moment before nodding to herself and continuing. Clara was right. The silence around my work wasn't indifference, it was engagement. It was respect. It was a connection, silent and profound, between my vision and a stranger's perception. I felt a flush of pride so clean and sharp it brought tears to my eyes. "It's a powerful composition," a voice said beside me. "The way you use the light to give voice to the stone. It's not just a record. It's an interpretation." I turned, ready to thank another stranger, and my breath caught in my throat. It was him, the man from the museum. The one with the kind eyes and the advice about the clouds. He was taller than I remembered and dressed in a simple, well-cut navy blazer. He held a glass of wine in one hand and gestured toward my photo with the other. "You," I said, the word escaping before I could stop it. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. "You remember. The sarcophagus was being difficult. You told me to wait for the cloud. And you did," he extended his hand. "Ethan." I took it. His grip was firm, warm. "Natalie." "I know," he said, nodding toward the placard. I saw the name, and I had to come see if it was the same person with the good sense to listen to a stranger's advice about lighting. We fell into easy conversation. It was unlike any interaction I'd had in years. There was no subtext, no history, no unspoken baggage. We talked about photography, about the lost art of the darkroom, about his work. He was an architect, which explained his eye for structure and light. He asked about my process for the shot, and he listened, truly listened, to my answer. He remembered small details from our brief encounter at the Gardner, the kind of things I'd said. It was his positive trait, the one the randomization had chosen months ago, manifesting in real life. He is a great listener and remembers small details. We drifted through the gallery together, talking about the other pieces. It wasn't flirting, it was connecting. A meeting of two minds that spoke the same visual language. He was witty and self-deprecating, telling a funny story about a design of his that had gone hilariously wrong due to a miscommunication about the load-bearing properties of a particular type of glass. I found myself laughing, a real, unforced laugh that felt unfamiliar and wonderful in my chest. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a framed painting. I was smiling. My eyes were bright. I looked like myself. Not a victim, not a survivor, but a woman. Interested and interesting. He asked if I'd like to get a coffee sometime to continue the conversation. There's a place near my office that roasts their own beans. They make a pour-over that's almost a religious experience, and I, to my own astonishment, heard myself say, "I'd like that." We exchanged numbers. The act felt momentous. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed his name into my phone. Ethan, architect, coffee. He left shortly after, and I wandered the gallery for a while longer, my mind buzzing. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. It felt like the horizon of my life, which had been closed in by pain and survival for so long, had suddenly cracked open, revealing a sliver of dazzling, unknown sky. Our first coffee date was a week later. It was a nervous wreck. What did one wear? What did one talk about? I wasn't a dater. I was a curator, a mother, a divorcee in progress. The last time I'd been on a date, flip phones were still a novelty. But the moment I walked into the coffee shop, a cozy, book-lined place that smelled of heaven and roasted beans, and saw him sitting at a small table, 2 cups already steaming between us, the nerves melted away. He stood up as I approached, a simple, old-world gesture that felt incredibly charming. "I took a liberty," he said, gesturing to the cups. "I hope you don't mind. This one's an Ethiopian Yirgacheffe. Bright, floral, a little bit of citrus. I thought you might like it." He remembered how I took my coffee. Another small, stunning detail. We talked for 2 hours. It was easy. We spoke about our work, our pasts in broad, brushstroke terms. I told him I was divorced, that I had a son. He told me he had never been married, that his work had been his primary relationship for a long time. There was no pressure, no expectation, just conversation. And then he brought up the community cleanup, the randomized meeting parameter clicking into place. "You know, I think I might have seen you before the gardener actually," he said, sipping his coffee. "Months ago, over in the Fenway area, there was a city-organized cleanup day at the Victory Gardens. Were you there?" The memory surfaced through a fog of grief. A Saturday early on. I'd forced myself to go, needing to do something, anything, that wasn't wallowing. I'd worn 2 big gloves and picked up litter, my body on autopilot, my soul miles away. I said, surprised. I needed some air," he nodded. "I thought that was you." I remember seeing this woman, looking so terribly sad, but meticulously picking every piece of plastic out of a rosebush. I almost came over to say hello then, but it didn't seem like the right time. "You seemed untouchable." I was speechless. He had seen me. In my darkest, most isolated moment, a stranger had seen my pain and had respected it enough to keep his distance. Hordak, and now, here we were. "I'm glad you didn't," I said softly. "I wouldn't have been very good company." "I'm glad I waited for the right cloud to pass," he replied, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. We started seeing each other. Slowly, carefully, a coffee a week, then a walk through the arboretum, where we both brought our cameras and pointed out interesting bark patterns on trees to each other. It was comfortable, it was kind. It was healing in a way I hadn't known I needed. He never pushed, he never asked about Daniel. He asked about Leo, about my work at the museum, about my photography. He celebrated my small victories. He made me feel seen for who I was now, not for who I had been. One evening, we found ourselves standing on the Mass Ave Bridge, watching the lights of Boston glitter on the Charles River. The city skyline was a photograph I'd taken 100 times, but it looked different through his eyes. "It's a good horizon," he said, following my gaze. "It is," I agreed, and for the first time, I wasn't looking at it as a boundary. I was looking at it as a promise. He didn't try to kiss me then. He just stood beside me, a solid, quiet presence, sharing the view. And in that shared silence, I realized I was no longer just building a new life for myself and for Leo. I was, perhaps, making room in it for someone new. The thought was no longer terrifying. It was just another part of the horizon, waiting to be explored. The scent of fresh paint and new wood hung in the air of the modern apartment, a clean, hopeful smell that had slowly begun to overwrite the musty silence of the old house. Boxes were stacked against the walls, a chaotic library of our new life waiting to be unpacked. But one corner of the living room was already complete. A large, comfortable sofa faced a wall where a single piece of art was hung, my photograph of the Icelandic iceberg, now framed in simple, clean black. It was our home, ours. Not a monument to a broken past, but a foundation for a future we were building, brick by careful brick. Leo, now 9, was kneeling on the floor, meticulously arranging his Lego starships on the low shelf Ethan had built for him just the weekend before. "This one can go here," he declared, his voice filled with the authority of a fleet admiral. "And the command station can watch from here. To see the enemies coming." Ethan, kneeling beside him, nodded with grave seriousness. "Strategic. I like it. What's the shield capacity on that cruiser? Will it hold if the enemy attacks from the port side?" I leaned against the doorway, watching them, a mug of tea warming my hands. This was our rhythm now. Our music. It wasn't always perfect. There were stumbles and awkward moments, the natural friction of 3 lives learning to orbit a new sun. Leo had moments of quiet sadness, of anger he didn't know how to express. There were times when I'd catch a certain look on Ethan's face, a fleeting shadow of uncertainty about his place in this delicate ecosystem. And I had my own fears, moments of panic that this beautiful, fragile thing we were building could still shatter. But we were learning. We were talking, always talking. Ethan's positive trait wasn't just a random assignment, it was the bedrock of us. He listened. He remembered the small things. He remembered that Leo hated the crusts on his sandwiches and that I got a headache if I had too much coffee. He remembered the story behind my photograph on the wall, and he'd sometimes just stand and look at it, as if seeing a part of my history he respected but would never try to own. Our shared activity visiting every coffee shop in the city had become our weekend ritual. It was our way of exploring our new home together, of creating a shared map of the city that was ours alone. Leo would bring a book or his sketchpad, and Ethan and I would talk, our knees touching under small, wobbly tables. One Saturday, we found ourselves in a tiny, hidden place in the North End, its walls lined with vintage Italian coffee cans. The air was thick with the rich, dark scent of espresso. "This one might be my favorite," I said, sipping a perfect cappuccino. "Because of the coffee?" Ethan asked, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Or because of the old man behind the counter who called you Bellissima?" I laughed. "Both." Leo looked up from his sketchbook. He said I was fortissimo. That means super strong. He flexed a skinny arm. "Because you are," Ethan said, tapping Leo's bicep with mock reverence. "You single-handedly built the Lego Star Destroyer. That requires immense strength." Leo beamed, going back to his drawing with renewed vigor. In that moment, the simple, easy affection between them felt like a miracle. It wasn't forced. It wasn't Ethan trying to be a father. It was just Ethan being Ethan, kind, attentive, and present. And Leo, in his resilience and open heart, was learning to accept a new kind of love. Later that night, after Leo was asleep in his new room, surrounded by starship models and posters of the solar system, Ethan and I sat on the sofa, the lights of the city twinkling outside our large windows. "He asked me about Daniel today," I said quietly, the words hanging in the comfortable silence between us. Ethan didn't tense up. He just listened, his hand finding mine. What did he ask? If it was okay that he sometimes forgot what Daniel's laugh sounded like. The memory of the question, asked so innocently over a bowl of cereal, had felt like a hand squeezing my heart. "What did you tell him?" I told him that memories are like photographs. Sometimes they get a little faded, but the important part is the feeling that was there when you took it. And that it was okay to make new memories. New photographs. Ethan was silent for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "That's a good answer," he said softly. "A very good answer." He looked around our apartment, at the boxes yet to be unpacked, at the photograph on the wall, at the Lego fleet guarding the shelves. "It feels like home, Natalie," he said, his voice filled with a kind of wondering gratitude. "It really does." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were happy tears. Tears of completion. "It does," I whispered. This wasn't a fairy tale. There was no happily ever after, because that implied an ending. This was a happy right now. This was a foundation we had chosen to build together, upon the bedrock of the lessons learned from the wreckage of my past. It was strong because we knew its worth. It was real because we had built it ourselves, with patience, with communication, with trust, and with an immense amount of care. I thought of the iceberg in the photograph. It had been through a violent calving, a lonely journey, a slow melt. But the water from that melt had risen, condensed, and fallen as rain, feeding new life. It had become part of a new, larger whole. I was no longer that iceberg, alone and adrift. I was the rain. I was the new growth. I was part of a family. A different family than the one I'd once imagined, but a strong one. A healthy one. Ours. Ethan leaned over and kissed my forehead, a gentle, grounding press of his lips. "To many more coffee shops," he murmured. "To many more coffee shops," I agreed, leaning into him, into the solid, steady warmth of our future. The foundation was poured. The walls were up. Now we got to live in it.